In the West, we have this new narrative that the tide has turned in the favor of Ukraine, that the Russians are doing poorly on the battlefield, and this drone campaign against targets deep inside of Russia are having a significant economic and political effect on Russia. And the belief is that given this newfound success, what we have to do is we have to put great pressure on Russia to come to the bargaining table and work out a deal to settle the war. So you don't hear Rubio or others in the administration saying that we have to defeat Russia. This is not the same approach that we took early in the war when we were talking about actually knocking the Russians out of the ranks of the great powers. You don't see that rhetoric anymore. The argument that Rubio is making is that we have to settle this war. It can't be settled on the battlefield. It has to be settled diplomatically. But the only way you can get the Russians to reach some sort of diplomatic bargain, some sort of agreement, is to inflict significant pain on them, both on the battlefield and with this drone and missile campaign that's aimed at targets deep inside of Russia. So that's essentially what's going on here. And the question you have to ask yourself is whether you think the tide has really turned, that the Russians are losing this war, and that the Russians are just going to sit there and allow Ukraine and the West operating together to inflict significant punishment on Russia.
And so the question is going to be, is that going to succeed? Because if that doesn't succeed, then all that does is leave you with this never-ending war, which President Trump allegedly says is something he was against, although I guess his words really carry no weight anymore. How do you see that?
Well, let's distinguish, Danny, between what's happening on the battlefield and what's happening in terms of this bombing campaign against Mother Russia. I think with regard to what's happening on the battlefield, the Russians are actually winning. Everything I read tells me that they're on the move, and they're well on their way to taking control of all of the Donbass, and this should be accomplished by the end of the summer, if not the early fall. I see no evidence that the Ukrainians are reversing the situation on the ground. So I don't know what people are talking about there. And if you read all the articles that are written on this subject carefully, there's no evidence in those articles that the Ukrainians have turned the tide. So this brings us to the whole question of the campaign of the bombing campaign deep into Russia with mainly drones, but also some missiles. And the question is, can the West and Ukraine working together inflict significant punishment on Russia and cause Russia to come to the negotiating table and cut a deal that's actually quite favorable to Ukraine? Is that possible? And there's no question that the Russians understand the game that the West is playing here, right? They understand that the West is cooperating big time with Ukraine, and that if anything, the West and Ukraine intend to escalate this air campaign, this drone campaign against Mother Russia, and the situation is only going to get worse with the passage of time. Now, of course, people like Rubio think that this will bring the Russians to the negotiating table. It will get them to throw up their hands. I don't think that's going to happen. First of all, you want to talk about what Putin's reaction is to all of this. It's quite clear from recent comments that he's made that he believes that the West is at war with Russia. He thinks that the West is out to defeat Russia. And he, of course, is not going to allow that to happen. So the question that is then raised is, what does Putin do? And I believe that there is lots of evidence that the Russians are preparing themselves to strike military targets in Europe with conventional weapons. And if that doesn't work, they will use nuclear weapons. Now, Putin, of course, has not said this, but Sergei Karaganov has famously made this argument in the West. And if you read the Russian media carefully, there are all sorts of people inside of Russia who agree with Karaganov that it's time for the Russians to take off the gloves. Look, the perspective from Moscow goes, it's the West plus Ukraine that is responsible for these attacks on the Russian homeland. It's not just Ukraine. Ukraine could not do this by itself. It's the West, and that includes President Trump. Indeed, the Kiev Independent, a major newspaper inside of Kyiv, just had a big story that said that President Trump has basically sanctioned this bombing campaign that Ukraine is engaged in. And in fact, the Kyiv Independent was saying it's not just the Europeans plus the Ukrainians against the Russians, it's the Ukrainians, the Europeans, and the Americans against the Russians. President Trump is back on the side of the Ukrainians. Given this situation, the Russians understand that they have to do something to respond. Because again, the Ukrainians and the Europeans, not so much the Americans on this issue, have promised further escalation. And by the way, one could interpret Marco Rubio's comments to indicate that the Americans are committed to further escalation. Regardless, the Russians think the situation's only going to get worse. And then you want to ask yourself, do you think the Russians are going to surrender or not? I don't think that's going to happen. I think that Sergei Karaganov's logic is going to apply, and that at some point in the not too distant future, the Russians are likely to attack targets in Europe. And this makes the situation surrounding the Ukraine war, in my opinion, really dangerous, because I don't think that most people in the West, certainly most people in the foreign policy establishment, take the Russian threat seriously. And by the way, this is Karaganov's argument. Karaganov's argument is that Russia has been unable to establish red lines with the West. The West believes, and Ukraine believes, that they can slap the Russians around and the Russians will not respond. They will not do anything like attack targets in Europe. And Karaganov's argument, which I believe increasing numbers of Russians believe, is that what Russia has to do is it has to make it clear that there are red lines. It has to establish a deterrent. It has to put an end to these attacks on Mother Russia. And there's only one way to do that, and that's to attack targets in Europe, first with conventional weapons, and if that doesn't work, then turn to nuclear weapons.
Yeah, it's hard to believe we're even having this conversation today, and I can assure you, I can confirm exactly what you said from both the U.S. and the Russian side. There are those most everybody in America and in Europe, and we're going to see some evidence of this in a second, do not believe that Russia has any red lines and that they would ever cross that line. They believe that the Article 5 piece of paper that says attack on one is attack on all is like a get out of jail free card, and that Russia would therefore never attempt to do that. So they do think that we can do anything. And I have seen also from some Russian sources just in the last 24 hours that confirm also what you said, that they believe that they're mad at President Putin. In fact, they say we should have done something much harder, some of these earlier things where the red lines were crossed, and then we wouldn't be in this situation today. But now then they say it's better late than never, but we, quote, have to take this action. Now, obviously, that's not Vladimir Putin. He did not return to my call, so I don't know what he's thinking, I'll just point out. But I know that a lot more on the Russian side are thinking that. So now then the question is going to be, what are we going to do about it? I've talked to you a little bit about the U.S. side here. Now let's go to the European side, and it's going to get a little bit uglier. Here's one that's more embarrassing than it is ugly, but it also is that. This is Mark Rutte in the White House just lathering up on President Trump and playing up to all of his arrogance and all of his love for praise.
The Trump trillion shows you the increase Europeans and Canadians are paying into defense since you took office in 2017. Right. Trump 45 plus Trump 47. A total of extra spent by the Europeans and the Canadians of 1.2 trillion. When you look at the effect of Trump 47, so the isolated effect of the extra defense spending in 2025 and in 2026, you see almost $140 billion extra spent nominal on defense by the Europeans and the Canadians. And also this year you will again see an increase by about 120 billion, which brings a total in 2 years of over $250 billion. I can assure you this is because of Russia, because of the threat, but I'm also absolutely convinced that you being President of the United States, being consistently pushing for something which since Eisenhower has not been achieved, which is the Europeans equalizing their defense spending with the United States.
You know, I was thinking more in the Eisenhower, the warning about the military-industrial complex, which was on graphic display there. He might want to have added that. Do you think that this is going to move President Trump to go further down the path we saw Rubio talking about of supporting Ukraine?
I think it might. I think, Danny, and these issues are very complicated at this point in time because so many different conflicts are at play. But I think if you look at what's happening in Iran, President Trump is being forced to make huge concessions to the Iranians. And his critics, who are many inside the foreign policy establishment, are accusing him of being an appeaser, of giving in to the evil Iranians, for being weak, for being the equivalent of Neville Chamberlain. In that situation, I think Trump has a deep-seated interest in being portrayed as a tough guy on Ukraine so that he can compensate for the problems that he's facing because of the concessions he appears willing to make on Iran. So I think that events in the Middle East are going to be of great importance for influencing how Trump thinks about dealing with Ukraine. And I think it's likely that Trump will play hardball with Russia on the Ukraine issue to compensate for his problems regarding Iran.
Well, we'll certainly see how that's going to go, but that can't be good because it's just not. I mean, you alluded to it there, but when you look at all of the ammunition and weapons we spent with Ukraine for 4.5 years, with Israel for 2.5 years, closing in on 3 now, and then what we've expended here, and then what we're selling to other people around the world. We're in a dearth of ammunition and weapons, so maybe that's part of what they think about. They're going to ramp up defense spending. But John, look, that stuff would take years to actually replace that, and we're not anywhere near. Why are we even dithering around the corner of potentially spending more or sending more of our ammunition? Forget about the money. It's the actual ammunition is what matters, and if we keep sending it to Ukraine, that's going to dwindle our resources even more. Are you worried about that?
No, I think you're missing the key issue here, Danny. The key issue is the drone war against Russia. And all we have to do, and this is reasonably easy to do working with the Europeans, is help Ukraine build up an even bigger inventory of drones, an even more deadly inventory of drones, and then help provide them with the intelligence to employ those drones against targets deep inside of Mother Russia. And that we can do. I think your points are applicable to what's happening on the battlefield. If you're interested in reversing events on the battlefield, then Danny Davis's rhetoric from a minute ago kicks in. But if you're focusing not on the battlefield, but you're focusing on the drone war, it's a very different story. And this is why the Russians understand that when the West and Ukraine promise that things are bad now, but they're going to get much worse with the passage of time, this is true. the West and Ukraine working together can make this drone war much more effective, much more deadly. And that is a huge problem for the Russians, who believe, quite correctly, that there are no red lines here. I don't think Trump, any more than the Europeans, believe that the Russians will kick back if we continue to escalate our assistance to Ukraine in its waging of the drone war.
Okay, well, you know, as it turns out, there's a couple of voices from Europe, and I think it was today, maybe it was yesterday when the video was actually made. Ursula von der Leyen seems to be completely backing up your contentions on this support for drones.
Ukraine's defense industry, with Europe's support, is showing that it can out-innovate Russia's. Ukraine now produces drones at a scale that matches and even exceeds Russian production capacity. And the determination of the Ukrainian people has shown to the world that their European choice cannot be broken. And now it is our task to turn that choice into a reality. Earlier this month, indeed, we opened the first cluster of negotiations with Ukraine, and this was a historic moment. A recognition of the remarkable progress Ukraine has made already, and a strong signal that Ukraine's future belongs in our European family.
Literally no discussion, and that was just one soundbite, but she makes no discussion at all about looking for a negotiated way to end the war unless, as she later describes, it's effectively a surrender of the Russian side to just give Ukraine what it wants, maybe along the line of contact. That's about as far as it'll go. But it sounds to me like they don't even want that. They just want this perpetual, open-ended thing of more military capacity for Ukraine going into Russia.
Exactly. I mean, everything that Ursula said reinforces the point that I was making. And what you want to do is put yourself in Vladimir Putin's shoes and think about how he views those comments. And needless to say, he believes, quite correctly, that Europe has basically declared war on Russia. That's his worldview. And now what you and I are saying is that Trump is moving in that direction. That Trump, who once promised to shut this war down and looked like he was going to be a bosom buddy of Vladimir Putin, is, if anything, moving in the opposite direction. And I made the argument that that is definitely likely to happen because of events in Iran. But regardless, the fact is that from Putin's point of view, the Europeans have effectively declared war against Russia. And furthermore, as we've talked about, the Europeans and the Americans and the Ukrainians don't respect Russian red lines. So if you're in Putin's shoes, Danny, what do you do? What do you do? You're in his shoes.
We're going to hear from his mouth here in just a second, but one final piece there to really reinforce this a little bit more. We know, of course, that months ago, Germans sent an armor brigade into the Baltics as a forward deployed branch of NATO. They talked about how they're going to have the biggest land army in Europe, so they're trying to build up to that. And then we have Chancellor Merz at that same conference added this.
Dear friends and colleagues, in these days we are seeing a new dynamic. The G7 summit, the European Council last week, and the E5 meeting in Berlin yesterday have sent strong signals of European and transatlantic unity and support for Ukraine. Ukraine and its brave people will prevail as a strong and sovereign nation and as a future member of the European family.
They will prevail. All the stuff that Ursula said, all the stuff that Germany is doing. I mean, again, I go back to what do you think, what you just asked about what is Russia going to think. But let me ask you that specific question on Germany. How much of this is rhetoric? Because you're also looking at how Russia's observing all of this, because they claim many, Mark Rutte and some others, even in Germany and France, that we could be at war with Russia by 2029 or 2030. And so they're building up. But can they really? Do you think that Germany actually has the military capacity, let's say by 2030, to actually be a formidable military with ground force, air force, drones, missiles, et cetera, to actually threaten Russia?
No, but I don't think they're talking about threatening Russia with a conventional army. They don't have the World War II model in mind. Again, what they think is providing the magic formula is technology. It's drones. They think that they have discovered a way of getting at Russia that provides the West and Ukraine with a remarkable amount of coercive leverage. That's what's going on here. I think they fully understand that, first of all, they don't have the capability to rebuild the Wehrmacht, if we're talking about Germany. And furthermore, if they do rebuild the Wehrmacht, it's kind of hard to imagine World War II all over again, because who in their right mind would want to do that, in addition to the fact that you're in a nuclear world? So that's not what's going to happen here. They see Ukraine as the frontline state. Right. And to the extent that the Europeans are going to engage the Russians militarily, they don't want to do it on German territory or Polish territory. They want to do it on Ukrainian territory. And they think the key is just to be able to hold on the battlefield. Right. Remember, I said the Russians are winning on the battlefield. There's no question in my mind about that, but they're winning slowly. And people in the West think that they can actually stymie the Russians on the battlefield so that the Russians can't even win slowly. And once you stymie the war on the battlefield, then you turn to the air war. You turn to using drones and maybe eventually sophisticated cruise missiles as well. And you hit targets inside of Russia. That's the magic weapon that they're focusing on. This is what's given them, giving Western leaders this false hope, and giving Ukrainian leaders as well this false hope that they can turn the tide and win the war.
And what is even in the mind of the West? And I'm going to ask, this is kind of a two-part question. First of all, why do they think that using technology and drones and stuff is going to cause Russia to capitulate when it hasn't worked on Ukraine? Because they have been subject to tremendous amounts of long-range drones and the FPV drones and the fiber optic drones, you name it, and that hasn't caused them to capitulate, which is just a massive, massive years-long operation. Why do we think that a few more drones from the West is going to cause the much bigger Russia to capitulate?
I make the same argument all the time. I mean, the historical record, even beyond the Russian campaign against Ukraine, supports your point. There's no question about it. The idea that drone attacks are going to bring the Russians to their knees. Furthermore, as you and I have emphasized from the beginning of this war, from Russia's point of view, what's going on in Ukraine is of an existential nature. Right. This is an existential threat. And when the Europeans and the Americans basically ally themselves fully with Ukraine and make it look like they're going to integrate Ukraine into the Western security architecture, this, if anything, just increases Russian fear. And this is what gives Russia the incentive to think about employing the Sergei Karaganov strategy. That's what's going on here. I think what people in the West don't understand, Danny, is that if the West and Ukraine operating together are successful, that increases the likelihood of nuclear war. The situation from Danny Davis's and John Mearsheimer's point of view is getting increasingly dangerous. We're scared. We're nervous. We think this is not going to have a happy ending. But you and I are at odds with most people in the national security community. They think that you can just slap the Russians around. You can ignore what they believe are red lines, the Russians believe are red lines, but are really not red lines, and get the Russians to capitulate at the negotiating table.